The last thing anyone saw was a faded blue sedan parked carelessly by the treeline. The dust of the backroads still clung to its paint, a final testament to the journey that brought them here. For two teenagers, it was the perfect escape, a weekend of freedom, a canvas of green and blue stretched out beneath the endless sky. They had packed a small tent, sleeping bags, and a cooler full of youthful optimism, ready to vanish into the wilderness for a few blissful days. They did vanish, but not in the way they planned. For 137 days, they were nothing more than a ghost story whispered around town, a cautionary tale of what can be lost in the vast, indifferent heart of the wilderness. Then, the silence was shattered not by a sound, but by a chilling discovery that spoke volumes. It was not a body, but a piece of evidence so bizarre, so out of place that it didn't just deepen the mystery. It twisted it into something far more sinister than anyone had dared to imagine. Before the silence, there was life. The life of two young people on the precipice of their future. Mark and Sarah. They were the kind of couple that seemed to radiate a quiet, comfortable contentment. They had met in their high school history class, bonded over a shared fascination with the past, and built a future on the foundation of shared dreams. Mark was a budding engineer, meticulous and grounded, with a love for old machinery and the simple logic of how things work. He spent his weekends tinkering with a battered pickup truck, his hands always stained with grease. Sarah, on the other hand, was an artist, a dreamer who saw the world in a kaleidoscope of colors and emotions. She filled sketchbooks with portraits of people she passed on the street and landscapes that existed only in her imagination. Their personalities were a study in contrast, but together, they created a harmonious whole. Their friends and family had watched their relationship blossom with a sense of quiet approval. There was a sense of inevitability about them, as if they were always meant to find each other. The trip was Mark's idea. He had found a secluded camping spot on a tattered old map, a place he said was so remote, so untouched, that it felt like stepping back in time. It was a place where the stars weren't dimmed by the glow of streetlights, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a nocturnal bird. Sarah, though a city girl at heart, was easily swayed by his enthusiasm. She pictured a weekend of drawing under the open sky, of late-night conversations by a crackling fire, of escaping the suffocating predictability of their suburban lives. They left on a Friday morning, the sun glinting off the hood of Mark's old sedan as they drove away. Mark's mother, standing on the porch, waved until the car was a distant speck, a small gesture of farewell that would haunt her for years to come. The initial days of their disappearance were filled with a frantic but hopeful energy. When they didn't return on Sunday night, their parents assumed they had simply extended their trip, caught up in the magic of the moment. It was a reasonable assumption for two young lovers, and it was the kind of thinking that would, in retrospect, seem like a cruel form of denial. But by Monday morning, when their parents' calls went straight to voicemail, a different kind of feeling began to set in, a cold, creeping dread that felt like a premonition of something terrible. By Monday afternoon, the police had been notified. The search began with a sense of urgency. The local sheriff's department, supplemented by volunteers, fanned out across the vast expanse of the forest. The woods, which had seemed so inviting in the photos Mark had shown Sarah, now loomed with a sense of silent menace. Search parties combed the trails, their voices echoing through the trees, a desperate symphony in the face of an overwhelming silence. Helicopters crisscrossed the sky, their rotors a rhythmic thrum that seemed to mock the futility of their efforts. But the forest held its secrets close. The sedan was found within hours, just as Mark's map had indicated it would be. It was unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, and their belongings were neatly packed in the trunk. The tent, sleeping bags, and cooler were all gone. It was a testament to their intention to camp, but it offered no clues as to where they had gone. The search intensified. The area around the car was scoured, every bush, every rock, every patch of moss examined for a sign, a footprint, anything. Nothing. The trail, it seemed, had gone cold before it had even begun. As the days turned into weeks, the hope that had sustained the search began to fray. The media descended on the small town, their cameras a constant presence, their questions a repetitive chorus of what happened, and is there any new information. The families of Mark and Sarah were thrust into a spotlight they never wanted, their private grief laid bare for public consumption. They put up posters with the smiling faces of their children, a stark and painful contrast to the grim reality of their situation. Every phone call, every knock on the door was a moment of agonizing anticipation, a fleeting hope that this time it would be good news. But it never was. The case file grew thicker, filled with endless reports of nothing, of dead ends, of trails that vanished into the unfeeling earth. It became a cold case, a ghost of a story that haunted the town, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the terrifying power of the unknown. The police, with a sense of weary resignation, scaled back their efforts. The volunteers, their initial fervor replaced by a quiet sense of defeat, went back to their lives. The forest, having swallowed its secrets, returned to its silent, eternal vigil. The seasons turned. The vibrant green of summer gave way to the fiery hues of autumn, and then to the stark, skeletal silence of winter. Snow fell, a thick, muffling blanket that covered the forest floor and buried any lingering traces of the missing couple. The world moved on. Mark and Sarah became a memory, a name whispered in hushed tones, a tragic footnote in the town's history. But for their families, time had stopped. The silence that had swallowed their children was a constant presence, a hollow ache in their hearts that refused to heal. They were left to mourn a loss that had no closure, a pain that had no resolution. The lack of a body was a cruel trick, a false glimmer of hope that kept them from truly letting go. For 137 days, the mystery was an empty canvas, waiting for a single brushstroke of truth. That truth, when it finally arrived, was a shocking and grotesque masterpiece. The discovery was made by a pair of hikers, two young men who had braved the late winter chill for a day of exploring. They were off the main trail, drawn by the promise of a secluded waterfall they had seen on a topographical map. What they found, nestled in a small, rocky clearing, was not a waterfall but a tent. It was not a typical camping tent, but an old, canvas army-style tent, weathered and torn, its colors faded to a nondescript gray. Its presence in the middle of a remote forest, miles from any marked trail, was immediately suspicious. The hikers, their curiosity outweighing their caution, approached the tent. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the silence of the forest, but the dead, unnatural silence of something abandoned. There were no footprints in the snow around it, no signs of recent activity. They called out, their voices swallowed by the dense trees, and received no reply. One of them, a bit bolder than the other, carefully pushed open the flap. The scene inside was a time capsule of a life abruptly ended. There were two sleeping bags, unzipped and laid out, a small cooler, its contents long since spoiled, and a scattering of personal effects. But there was also a pervasive sense of unease, a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air. The hikers, unnerved, retreated and immediately called the police. The discovery of the tent sent a jolt of renewed energy through the weary investigative team. The same officers who had combed the forest in the fall, now older and wearier, returned to the scene. The clearing was cordoned off, and a team of forensic specialists arrived. What they found inside the tent was both expected and deeply unsettling. The sleeping bags belonged to Mark and Sarah. The cooler contained the remnants of their food. A small portable radio was still on the ground, its antenna bent at an unnatural angle. A camera with an exposed roll of film lay beside it, a potential treasure trove of information. But it was not these items that would define the case. It was something else, something so strange that it seemed to belong to a different story entirely. Tucked under one of the sleeping bags, as if intentionally hidden, was a small, ornate wooden box. It was locked, and the investigators, with a sense of profound anticipation, carefully pried it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a single, intricately carved object, an arrowhead made of jet black stone, unlike any they had ever seen. The stone was smooth to the touch, and its edges were perfectly, unervingly sharp. But the most chilling detail was not the arrowhead itself, but the strange, almost indecipherable symbols that had been etched into its surface. The forensic team, their initial optimism giving way to a new kind of dread, meticulously documented every detail of the scene. The bent radio antenna, the camera, its film sent for immediate development, the small box and its strange contents. But the most baffling piece of evidence was the lack of any struggle, any sign of violence, any of the things that would normally be associated with a crime scene. The tent was neat, almost untouched, a perfect tableau of two lives that had simply ceased to be. There were no footprints leading away from the tent in the surrounding snow. It was as if Mark and Sarah had simply evaporated. The arrowhead, in particular, was an object of intense scrutiny. Its strange symbols, which resembled an ancient script or a cryptic language, were photographed and sent to experts in archaeology and ancient civilizations. No one could identify them. The arrow itself was a paradox, a weapon of a bygone era, found in a modern crime scene, and a piece of evidence that, on its surface, seemed to have no connection to the missing couple. The families were brought in to identify the items. The sight of their children's belongings, laid out on a cold, sterile table, was a brutal reenactment of their grief. Sarah's mother held the small camera, her hands trembling, imagining the last images her daughter had captured. Mark's father looked at the bent radio antenna, a small, inconsequential detail that spoke of an interruption, a moment of sudden silence. The strange arrowhead, however, was a source of complete confusion. Neither family had ever seen it before. It was an alien object in their children's lives, a jarring note in the symphony of their disappearance. The discovery of the tent and the bizarre artifact raised more questions than it answered. It shattered the initial assumption that Mark and Sarah had simply been lost to the wilderness, that they had succumbed to the elements. The neatness of the tent, the lack of struggle, and the presence of the strange arrowhead suggested a far more organized, far more deliberate act. The mystery, which had been dormant for months, had just been reawakened, and this time it had a sharper edge, a darker hue. The film from a camera was the next piece of the puzzle, a tantalizing glimpse into the last moments of Mark and Sarah's lives. The development process was handled with the utmost care, every frame a potential revelation. The images, when finally revealed, were a collection of youthful memories and quiet, pastoral scenes. There were photos of Mark setting up the tent, his brow furrowed in concentration. There were images of Sarah smiling, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a campfire, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. There was a series of photos of the surrounding landscape, lush and green, captured with a keen artistic eye. The film told a story of a peaceful, joyful weekend, a narrative of simple pleasure and quiet contentment. Then, on the very last frames, the story changed. There was a blurry, unfocused image of the forest floor, as if the camera had been dropped. And on the final 2 frames, a dark, obscured shape, and then nothing. It was not a grand conclusion, but a final, abrupt stop, a visual cliffhanger that mirrored the abrupt end of their lives. With the initial assumption of a simple disappearance debunked, the investigation shifted. The focus turned from where did they go to what happened in that tent. The arrowhead, the single most compelling piece of evidence, was sent to a lab for advanced analysis. The black stone, it was discovered, was not obsidian as first thought, but a rare volcanic rock found only in a handful of remote, geologically active regions. The symbols etched into its surface, when viewed under a high-powered microscope, revealed an even more unsettling truth. They were not etched with a modern tool, but with a primitive, almost archaic technique, suggesting a level of craftsmanship that defied explanation. A team of experts was assembled, a motley crew of linguists, archaeologists, and cryptographers, all of whom were baffled by the strange markings. They ran the symbols through every known historical database, every ancient language, every forgotten script. The results were always the same. no match. The arrowhead was a ghost from a past that never existed, an object that should not have been. The investigation, now a matter of cold, forensic logic, turned to the surrounding area once again. The snow had melted, and the forest, now in the full bloom of spring, was a different landscape entirely. The investigators, guided by a new sense of purpose, scoured the ground for a wider radius around the tent. They found nothing that connected Mark and Sarah to the mysterious arrowhead. No trace of a third party, no footprints, no stray pieces of clothing. It was as if the couple had arrived, set up their tent, and then, at some point, a single object had materialized in their midst, a harbinger of a horror that was yet to be understood. The lack of a struggle was the most perplexing detail. Had they been taken by force? If so, why was there no evidence of a fight? Why was the tent so perfectly preserved? Had they left of their own volition? If so, why would they abandon their belongings, their car, their lives? The questions spiraled, each one a dead end, each one leading to a deeper sense of confusion and dread. It was an investigator named Detective Reynolds who had the breakthrough. He was a veteran of the force, a man with a quiet, observant demeanor and an uncanny ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. He was reviewing the original photos from the initial search, poring over the images of the car, the forest, the endless, empty landscape. He was looking at the small, seemingly insignificant details, the things that were too mundane to be considered evidence. It was an image of the ground near the sedan that caught his eye, a small, almost imperceptible detail in the dirt, now a ghost of a memory. It was a footprint, a single, faded impression that had been overlooked in the initial frenzy. It was too small to be Mark's, too large to be Sarah's. It was a third person, a third party who had been there at the scene of the disappearance, a silent observer in the final moments of their lives. Reynolds, his heart pounding with a sudden, electrifying sense of discovery, had the lab re-examine the original photographs. The image was digitally enhanced, its clarity sharpened, and the impression became clear. It was a partial print, just a portion of a shoe, but it was enough. It was enough to prove that a third person had been present at the scene. This discovery, while not a grand revelation, was a seismic shift. It shattered the narrative of a simple, tragic disappearance. It transformed the story from one of a natural tragedy to a calculated, intentional act. It introduced a new, darker line of inquiry. The mystery was no longer a puzzle of where, but of who and why. The quiet horror that had settled over the case for so many months was now replaced by a chilling new certainty. This was no accident. This was a crime, and the person who had committed it had left a single, silent, almost invisible clue in the dirt. A clue that had been waiting patiently for over 130 days to be found. The discovery of the partial footprint was a turning point, but it was also a new beginning, a descent into a much darker world. The narrative now shifted from the sad story of two lost teenagers to a complex, forensic investigation. The single footprint, a ghost in the soil, led the investigators down a path they were not prepared for. It was not a unique print, but it was a specific brand and size of boot, the kind worn by hikers, hunters, and anyone who spent a significant amount of time in the wilderness. It was a common item, a clue that could lead to anyone or no one at all. But Detective Reynolds was not deterred. He began to cross-reference the boot type with local residents, with known persons of interest, with anyone who had been reported in the area around the time of the disappearance. It was a painstaking, methodical process, a slow and deliberate crawl through a mountain of data. Meanwhile, the analysis of the arrowhead continued. The cryptographers, after weeks of fruitless work, had a new idea. They stopped trying to translate the symbols as a language and started to view them as a set of instructions, a code. They fed the symbols into a computer program designed to look for patterns, for sequences, for mathematical relationships. The results were staggering. The symbols, when arranged in a specific order, formed a series of coordinates. They were not for a specific location, but for a series of locations, a trail of breadcrumbs leading deeper and deeper into the forest. It It was a chilling realization. The arrowhead was not a random artifact, but a map. A dark, intentional trail laid out for someone to follow. The question, of course, was for whom? And to what end? The investigators, now armed with a new purpose, a new line of inquiry, prepared to follow the coordinates. The families of Mark and Sarah were notified of the new developments, a painful and exhilarating conversation. The news, though terrifying, brought with it a renewed sense of purpose. The hope of finding their children, once a fading ember, was now a small, flickering flame. The police, accompanied by a search and rescue team, set out into the forest, following the strange, coded map. The first coordinate led them to a small, secluded cave, its entrance almost completely obscured by a thick curtain of ivy. Inside, the air was cold and damp, and the only sound was the slow drip of water from the ceiling. There was nothing of Mark and Sarah, but there was another strange object, a small, intricately carved wooden figure, a grotesque representation of a human form, with the same strange symbols etched into its surface. It was a signpost, a confirmation that they were on the right path. The next coordinate led them to a winding, narrow gorge, its walls slick with moss. At the bottom, partially buried in the mud, was a small, rusted arrowhead, identical to the one found in the tent. It was another sign, another chilling piece of the puzzle. The trail continued, a macabre scavenger hunt, each clue leading to a new, unsettling discovery. A rusted metal box, half buried in the soil, contained a single, faded photograph of Mark and Sarah, a picture that had been taken by Sarah's camera, but one that was not on the developed film. The image was grainy and unfocused, as if taken from a distance by someone watching them. It was a haunting and deeply personal violation, a chilling confirmation that they had been stalked, watched, and pursued. The final coordinate led them to a remote, desolate part of the forest, a place that was known locally as the Barrens, a stretch of land where the trees were sparse and the earth was rocky and unforgiving. It was here, in a shallow, hastily dug grave, that they found what they had been dreading all along: the remains of Mark and Sarah. The scene was one of profound, heartbreaking tragedy. The couple had been buried side by side, their bodies arranged in a quiet, almost reverent manner. There was no sign of a violent struggle, no obvious cause of death. It was as if they had simply laid down and passed away. But as the forensic team worked to exhume the bodies, they made a final, horrifying discovery. Tucked into the hand of each of them, clutched in a silent, final grip, was a small, perfectly carved arrowhead. The same black, jet-like stone, the same strange symbols. It was the last, most chilling message from a killer who had never been caught, a final, grotesque punctuation mark on a story of profound and senseless violence. The discovery of the bodies was not an end, but a beginning. The investigation, now a murder case, took on a new sense of urgency. The absence of a clear cause of death, combined with the strange, ritualistic burial, presented a unique and complex challenge. The bodies were sent to the state coroner's office for a full, meticulous autopsy. The results were as baffling as the crime itself. There are no signs of blunt force trauma, no stab wounds, no bullet holes. There were no obvious signs of poisoning, no trace of sedatives or other drugs. It was as if Mark and Sarah had simply ceased to be, their hearts having stopped without any apparent external cause. The only physical anomaly, a detail that was at first dismissed as an artifact of decomposition, was a series of small, almost invisible puncture marks on the back of their necks, as if they had been injected with something. But the forensic team could find no trace of what had been used. It was a crime that defied explanation, a murder without a murder weapon. The case was now a media firestorm. The quiet, tragic story of two missing teenagers had been transformed into a macabre tale of a serial killer, a ritualistic murderer who roamed the remote corners of the forest. The town, which had mourned in silence, was now gripped by collective terror. The fear was not of the unknown anymore, but of a known and uncatchable monster. The police were under immense pressure to find answers, to make an arrest, to restore a sense of safety to a community that felt it had been irrevocably shattered. But the investigation was a dead end. The single footprint, the mysterious arrowheads, the bizarre circumstances of the murders. They all pointed to a killer who was not only highly organized, but who seemed to operate outside the bounds of traditional criminal logic. The investigators, their initial confidence now replaced by a quiet sense of frustration, went back to the only things they had: the arrowheads. The stone was a geological anomaly, and the symbols were a linguistic ghost. They reached out to a wider network of experts, to academic institutions, and to a handful of eccentric, independent researchers who specialized in the obscure. It was a retired professor of ancient history, an expert on forgotten Mesoamerican cultures, who made the final, terrifying connection. The symbols on the arrowheads were not a language, but a series of astrological markers, a map of the night sky, a constellation that, when viewed from a specific location on Earth, formed the shape of a serpent. The professor, his voice trembling with a mix of excitement and dread, explained that this constellation, in ancient cultures, was often associated with a deity of death and rebirth, a god who was said to guide souls into the afterlife. The realization was a chilling and profound one. The murders were not a random act of violence, but a ritual, a sacrifice. The killer was not just a murderer, but a fanatic, a zealot who believed he was performing a sacred act. The arrowheads were not just a map, but a spiritual offering, a tool of a twisted and ancient faith. The small puncture marks on the back of their necks were now seen in a new, horrifying light. It was not a poison, but a symbolic act, a ritualistic piercing to release the soul. The theory, though outlandish, fit the facts of the case in a way that nothing else did. It explained the lack of struggle, the lack of an obvious murder weapon, the strange, almost reverent way in which the bodies were buried. It also explained the photo of Mark and Sarah, taken from a distance, as if the killer was not just stalking his victims, but observing them, choosing them, waiting for the precise moment of their demise. The case, now forever intertwined with a dark, historical narrative, remains unsolved. The killer, if he even exists, was never found. The single footprint, the most tangible piece of evidence, led to nothing. The arrowheads, though now understood in a chilling new context, provided no clues to the identity of their maker. The story of Mark and Sarah, which began with a quiet, youthful adventure, ended with a macabre and perplexing act of violence. Their memory lives on not just in the hearts of their families, but in the annals of true crime, a chilling reminder that the deepest mysteries are often hidden not in the dark of the forest, but in the dark of the human heart. The silence that had swallowed them was not the indifferent silence of the wilderness, but the cold, impenetrable silence of an evil that had chosen them, marked them, and then, without a single sound, had taken them away.